I've always wanted to write about Oxenfree. In Night School Studios' debut game, you play as Alex, a teenager from a small town who's kinda going through it when she and her friends head to Edwards Island for the last beach bash of the summer. Per her school's time-honored tradition, Alex and the gang take the last ferry to or from the island for the day to trap themselves, without supervision, in Party Central. There's gonna be drinking and debauchery and delving into a cave on the beach to tune into some freaky radio signals that are gonna free a bunch of vengeful ghosts and oops. Now Alex and her friends have until sunrise to fix what they started, or they'll never make it off the island again. The game's got a classic teen horror story vibe that's kept me coming back to it each year since my first playthrough back in 2016. But that's not why I've always wanted to write about it. See, Oxenfree is set in a place I've spent most of my family vacations and day trips and holidays since, well, before I can even remember. It's set on the Oregon coast. Now, this place isn't Oahu or anything, you're not gonna be sunbathing here for most of the year, but it's like my favorite place on Earth. It's nice, in a rugged, quiet, and contemplative kind of way. And having so many of my own good memories on the Oregon coast, I can't help but look at Oxenfree and think, why set a horror game here? Now, focusing so much on Oxenfree's setting might seem like exactly the kind of pretentious move that only a YouTube video essayist would pull out of their stupid ass, but the game actively draws attention to it. Edwards Island, a fictional island at the mouth of the Columbia River, is without fail the largest thing on the screen at any given time. Because the game's camera, as it were, is so distant from our characters, they just get swallowed up by the scenery. The game tends to treat the island as its own character that visually, and sometimes thematically, dwarfs our actual protagonists. They look small and sparsely detailed in comparison. If it weren't for their speech bubbles, they'd be no more than smudges on a landscape painting. Which, actually, I guess they kind of are? Each of the game's backgrounds is hand-painted by the game's lead artist, Heather Gross. And, I mean, these are just hauntingly beautiful, right? Larches flickering warmly against a dark, cold tangle of conifer branches and basalt cliffs. The last leaves of the deciduous trees shimmering in the moonlight like fading stars. Her depictions of the Oregon coast aren't 100% true to life, though. Those gorgeous golden larches don't really grow out here, at least not as abundantly as her brush portrays. But I don't think that matters much. Her environments evoke the feel of someplace both in transition and out of time, which makes sense. In interviews, Gross speaks of spending a lot of time on the Oregon coast as a kid, so the Edwards Island we experience is, at least in part, a version of the coast that's crystallized in her memory. I think this reflects how Edwards Island exists in the minds of our protagonists, too. We always hear them describe it as it was when they were younger. The people may have come and gone with the tide, but the landscape hasn't changed much. It anchors them throughout time. The Oregon coast is home to some of the last, and oldest, old-growth forests in the United States. Each one is a prehistoric landscape preserved in living amber, standing tall in spite of the intense logging that has devastated most of the rest of the state. You can see why Night School pegged these woods as the setting for a horror story. It's darker here, colder. Ancient cedars, spruces, and firs grow dense. Their trunks, smothered by decades of moss, stand wider than your wingspan and taller than Lady Liberty. Their boughs knit together a thick black blanket of a canopy, below which the fronds of ferns fan out over the forest floor as they've done since the days of the dinosaurs. Sometimes you hike to the edge of the forest and you look down to see the mountain below you slump into the Pacific, and you know that, for miles around, this is all there is. In the right context, like being alone at night or, I don't know, haunted by ghosts from a Terran reality, an old growth could become the forest primeval, a scary prehistoric place where you feel like a blind, defenseless prey animal alone in the underbrush and stalked by unseen predators. Oxenfree enhances this feeling by peppering the landscape with dark, sheer cliffs that jut from the forest and into the sea. They become obstacles for exploration and traversal. Well, maybe obstacles isn't the right word. Complications, perhaps? Alex and the gang are all experienced rock climbers, apparently, so you never actually run the risk of falling and dying. Most of the game is just walking and talking, so I think they're there to break up the monotony and add an almost otherworldly indifference to Edwards Island. Unlike the Golden Larches, Basalt Cliffs aren't a fabrication of Oxenfree. Their exclusivity is, though. Perhaps the most prominent feature of the Oregon coast is the coastal range itself, whose sheer cliffs spill into the Pacific. As they do, they reveal their history to the world, written in lines of text that only geologists can read. Even without knowing the details, you understand that the natural history of this place surrounds you. The Peter Iredale was a British merchant ship that, in late 1906, was bringing British wheat to Portland by way of Mexico. Now, ships looking to enter the Columbia River from the Pacific Ocean have always had to pass through a stretch of rough seas known as the Graveyard of the Pacific, and it was here that the Iredale sailed into heavy fog and terrible wind. Unsurprisingly, the ship ran aground. With such force, I might add, that 3 of its 4 masts just snapped right off. All of the crew, and 2 stowaways, survived the crash and abandoned ship, but the Peter Iredale rests there to this day. In death, it's taken on new life as a tourist attraction. I mean, there's just something so dramatic about it, right? Its corroded steel hull juts out of the surf like the ribs of a huge whale, beached and rotting. A sight not unfamiliar to the people of the Oregon coast. And just a quick heads up before I get into this bit of the video, I'm about to talk about and show some footage of 2 dead whales. I wouldn't say any of it is graphic or gory, but I understand if you still find it unpleasant. So if you want to avoid that, skip to the timestamp on the screen. In fact, while I was capturing footage for this video, a dead fin whale made landfall just a few miles south of the wreck of the Iredale. We got there a few days after the researchers did. They had performed their autopsy, determined the cause of death to be an underlying condition, cut a few square-shaped holes into it so the gases could escape, and then just left it to rot. It all seems kind of anticlimactic, I know, but letting nature take its course like this has been the standard operating procedure for beached whales in Oregon ever since November of 1970. Back then, a whale washed ashore in the town of Florence, Oregon, which initially was a very smelly problem. Because Oregon's coastline was, and still is, technically classified as a highway, the cleanup responsibility fell in the Oregon State Highway Division. Now, they probably should have just buried the thing, but they figured it was only a matter of time before the tide dredged it up again. So, instead, they consulted with the US Navy to come up with an ingenious plan. It was environmentally neutral, only momentarily disruptive, and the spectacle of it could draw in a bit of tourism. Especially if Oregon's most watched news networks came by to cover the story of how Florence turned a whale to pink mist with half a ton of dynamite. Now, by the Highway Division's own admission, half a ton was pure guesswork. They had no idea exactly how many explosives it'd take to vaporize a whale. So, with around 100 onlookers and several news crews watching, Highway Division workers buried over 1,000 pounds of dynamite on the leeward side of the whale and hoped that, if worst came to worst, any big chunks would get blasted into the ocean where seagulls and crabs could feast on them. Instead, to quote K2 reporter Paul Linman, the blast blasted blubber beyond all believable bounds. Rotting whale meat buffeted the town like a hailstorm. Blubbery bits got into people's hair, their shoes, and even crushed someone's brand new car. The scavengers that were supposed to clean up were scared away by the blast. The stink of the rotting carcass spread even further, and to top it all off, the lower half of the whale remained mostly intact and had to be buried anyway. The Highway Division considered this explosion a success. The public, correctly, did not. though they did consider it a great anecdote, one still worth telling. So through landmarks and stories like the Peter Iredale or the exploding whale of Florence, the history of the Oregon coast remains as present as it ever was. The same is true of Edwards Island too, albeit in a much more unsettling way. The shadow of a sunken submarine hangs over the plot of Oxenfree. Remember the vengeful ghosts I mentioned at the top of the video? Well, they're called the Sunken. There are 97 of them, and they were all aboard the submarine USS Kanaloa when a Japanese sub sank it off the coast of Edwards Island in 1943. According to the official story, anyway. The actual story of the sinking of the Kanaloa is far more horrific. The Kanaloa was patrolling off the coast of Edwards Island in 1943 when, for unknown reasons, it sent out a distress message. But the sub's experimental nuclear reactor garbled the signal, so Maggie Adler, the island's communications director, saw this distorted message and assumed that the Japanese Navy was attempting to scramble their communications and prepare for an attack. On her orders, nearby ships were sent to scout for, and possibly fire upon, any enemy submarines they found. Instead, they found the Kanaloa. Unable to speak for itself, the submarine was bombarded, and its nuclear reactor suffered a direct hit. It instantaneously imploded, shunting all 97 passengers out of our dimension to a place where time and space were as fluid as the waves. Appropriately, we learn most of this Kanaloa lore in the most supernaturally charged and downright frightening area of the game, Fort Milner. Built during World War II and thereafter host to the US Army Radio Communications School, this now abandoned military installation was named for the fictional Civil War Major General Casey William Milner. Up to this point in Oxenfree, you've been hiking a timid web of dirt trails through a thicket of firs and larches. If you found any human-made structures, they've been of wood, stone, and rusted metal, natural materials, or at least materials being reclaimed by nature. So when you approach the wide paved paths and massive arched bridge that lead to Fort Milner, it's jarring. Within the confines of the fort are steel towers and concrete buildings multiple stories tall, which makes Fort Milner loom over the island like a hollow monument to some dead civilization. What's truly unsettling about the fort, though, is that it seems relatively untouched, in limbo. Early on in your exploration, you come across a room. Vines dangle from the ceiling like shadowy tentacles, and a single spaghetti cloud of graffiti has been splattered on the wall, but after that room, all signs of life, all signs of the passage of time just disappear. The radio communications school that used to occupy the fort was said to have moved to Southern California in 1974, over 40 years before the events of Oxenfree. Yet despite that time gap, vintage bed frames, posters, and radio equipment are the only signs of any human presence here. There's not even graffiti in its bowels. And it's not like the Edwards Island Tourism Board is going around and sprucing the place up, they've fenced it off. And yet, the fort seems to have only been glanced by decay. Nobody's come to urbex here. It's a concrete anachronism, stuck at the moment of its abandonment and unwilling to move on, unwilling to fully give in to decay and the new life that would bring. The same can't be said for Fort Milner's real-life inspiration, though. Constructed during the Civil War, Fort Stevens sat as a sentinel over the interior of the Pacific Northwest, protecting the mouth of the mighty Columbia River from Confederate naval raids in the middle of the 19th century and from Japanese submarine raids in the middle of the 20th. The fort, like its Oxenfree counterpart, was named for a Civil War officer, the very real Governor General Isaac Stevens. And similar to Fort Milner, Fort Stevens served as a radio listening station in the interwar years, secretly spying on the Japanese fleet until 1939. By then, the Navy had discovered that Bainbridge Island up near Seattle had way better reception for that kind of thing and moved the whole operation up there. It wasn't that big of a deal, though. The Navy had already been thinking of abandoning the fort, and when the war was over, they found their excuse to do just that. Now designated as a historical marker in a state park, the pillboxes and batteries of Fort Stevens are free for the public to wander. This fort feels less like an anachronism and more like a proper ruin. Its halls are stripped of bed frames, posters, and radio equipment. All that's left is the vague impression of the past. Lots of space for your imagination to fill in the gaps. They did leave this prototype fidget spinner here though, which is sorta cool. Instead of persisting past its expiration date like Fort Milner, Fort Stevens has flung open its doors and welcomed the decay. There's cracks on the walls, rot in the wooden support beams, and entirely flooded rooms. But to quote Tumblr user Personcinable. But to quote Tumblr user Personcinable, decay exists as an extant form of life. Let me explain. You used to be able to see the Pacific Ocean from here until the Navy left and the forest grew in. These chimneys, which would have once belted out plumes of smoke, belt out plumes of feathers now that the birds have roosted here. And I don't know what would have been on the walls of the fort back then, probably nothing, but they're covered in an ever-shifting canvas of art now. Finally, like Fort Milner, Fort Stevens had its own run-in with the submarine during the war. In fact, that incident is one of the only things people know about Fort Stevens, if they know anything about it at all. It was the first military installation in the continental United States to be attacked since the War of 1812. Late one June night in 1942, the Imperial Japanese submarine I-25 slipped past coastal mines and surfaced just beyond the mouth of the Columbia. It soon opened fire on Battery Russell. Equipped only with outdated artillery, the commander of Fort Stevens ordered a blackout and denied every request to return fire. He knew their only hope was to stay hidden in the inky silhouette of the coastline, and that any ray of light they cast would snuff that hope out. Surprisingly, this passive resistance worked. Nearly every shell whiffed the fort and hit the hillside or the nearby swamp. The I-25 then just slipped past an Air Force patrol to safety, meaning that the only casualty of the attack was the backstop of the fort's baseball field. Which would have been kind of a bummer, I guess. It's not like those soldiers could have played Subway Surfers or whatever to stave off the boredom. And, they only had the one fidget spinner to share, so... Anyway, a night raid by a Japanese submarine on a fort near the Columbia sounds a lot like the cover story of the sinking of the Kanaloa, just with a much happier ending. I still see why Night School would have drawn inspiration from the attack on Fort Stevens, though. If the fort had better equipment, or if the I-25 made luckier shots, or the fort's commander had left the lights on, this interesting footnote in World War II history could have become a horror show. Instead, one of the impact sites now houses a small monument to the continued peace between nations. The ancient woods, the old forts, the submarine mishaps, hell, the ever-present thrum of history. Not a minute goes by in Oxenfree where you're looking at the background and not thinking about the game's themes of nostalgia, trauma, and regret. In his interview with Heather Gross, blogger Miguel Penabea describes the world of Oxenfree as a hazy, dreamlike otherworld, stranded somewhere between past and present, real and unreal, living and dead. In other words, Edward's Island is...
Say the line, Bart!
a liminal space.
Yeah!
I started this essay wondering why this place that I cherish so deeply would have been chosen as the setting for a horror story. But in comparing Oxenfree's setting to its real-life inspirations, I realized something. The Oregon coast, too, is a liminal space, stranded somewhere between past and present, living and dead. A place like that is perfect for Oxenfree because it's not really a game about the horror of its situation. It's about that painful, confusing space between the previous stage of your life and the next one. It's a coming-of-age story. Like Edward's Island or the Oregon coast, Alex is a liminal being, at least when we meet her. Near the end of her high school career, she's forced to reckon with her future while still reeling from the absence of her older brother. She is stranded somewhere between past and present, living and dead, and in controlling her, we can push her to move on from adolescence into adulthood, and from denial into acceptance. For if we don't try to free her from this state of mind, she could wind up like the Sunken. In their timeless void outside of reality, they too are quite literally stranded between past and present, real and unreal, living and dead. They, and everything they touch, refuse to move on from the past, refuse to move on from their deaths. Because of this, they've been trapped in a liminal hell for what, to them, feels like several eternities. Their minds are consumed by fear and reckless apathy. They can think of nothing but themselves and their desire to return to the lives they used to know, lives which can no longer exist, and they'll go so far as to erase the subjectivity of a bunch of children to sate that desire. I see them as a kind of dark mirror to Alex, a vision of the monster she might become if she continues to languish in limbo. When I think about the story of Oxenfree in those terms, the Oregon coast becomes the only place to set it. The coast is living proof that while we can never truly escape our pasts, we can take the energy we wasted dwelling on lost time and use it to better ourselves. And the world around us. Thanks for watching.